The Miles Franklin Literary Award is perhaps the most prestigious literary award. It was established in 1954 by the generous benefaction of the famous Australian author Miles Franklin. Despite the fact she lived a life of some, indeed, poverty really, she worked hard to establish a corpus of funds that she thought she would give to the nation really as the Miles Franklin Literary Award. So she says that the award is to be given to a novel of the highest literary merit that tells Australian stories in Australian life in any of its phases. She was hoping that by offering this award, she would be giving writers opportunities that she didn't have. Despite the fact she was living in this kind of fairly modest circumstances, she was deliberately saving her pennies to establish this award. And that, the fact that she was so single-minded about creating an award which, in doing so, was hurting her own lifestyle is, I think, testament to the belief in which she had behind the award. She did believe that a country needed to tell its own story, so there was this kind of fundamental sense of nationalism, belief that Australia couldn't call itself a developed or sophisticated nation unless it could tell its own stories. That was a kind of fundamental part of the whole award. To be awarded the Miles, in a way, is inserting yourself or the author into a sort of pantheon of Australian literature, and I think that legacy is what drives the award forward.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Awards shortlist announcement.
Hello and welcome to the Miles Franklin shortlist announcement for 2020. I'm Cassie McCullagh. I'm from ABC Radio National's new fiction review program, The Bookshelf, and I'm delighted to be part of bringing you this announcement. Clearly, these times are unusual and so they lead to unusual measures, and that means that this year's presentation is being undertaken as a virtual event. And we appreciate everybody's support in making this happen. And the bonus of this is that it's now accessible to all, which is fantastic. My first point of order is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present and future. And I'd also like to give a thanks to Perpetual and the Copyright Agency's Cultural Fund for their strong support of the Miles Franklin Literary Award. I'm also pleased to announce that once again the ABC is the media partner for this award, which of course explains why I'm here talking to you now. And as we know, if it doesn't have a hashtag, it doesn't happen. So please get amongst it and post and tweet and Insta with #MFLA2020. That's hashtag Miles Franklin Literary Award 2020. As a previous winner, Josephine Wilson, the author of Extinctions, has said, the Miles Franklin defines the canon of Australian literature, and its true strength is not in the prize, but in the shortlist and the longlist. The value of the award is that it speaks not just to the past, but to the future. And just a bit of history. The award was established after Miles Franklin passed away in 1954 at the age of 74, and a sum of money from her estate was allocated to a trust fund which facilitated the inaugural award in 1957. That was awarded to Patrick White for his novel Voss. Quite a good choice. Impressively, Patrick went on to win again in 1961 for his novels Riders in the Chariot. Now, over the past 60-odd years or so, a few authors have won this prestigious award more than once. Thea Astley and Tim Winton have both won it 4 times. It's a celebration of both the abundant literary excellence that this country continues to produce, as well as that most sacred thing, Australian voices telling stories to fellow Australians and the rest of the world. And that's never been more important than right now. So let's get on with proceedings, and I'd like now to introduce Kim Williams to say a few words. Now, Kim is the chair of the Copyright Agency, our award sponsor, along with Perpetual. And as many of you will be aware, Kim has been at the forefront of the media and arts sectors in this country for his entire career and is a passionate advocate in that space. Please join me in welcoming Kim to say a few words.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Today we come together to celebrate the shortlisted nominees for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which, as you all know, was bequeathed by the ever remarkable, wholly original and proudly independent Stella Maria Sarah Miles Franklin. This shortlist announcement recognises, as her bequest requires, Australian works of literature that are of the highest literary merit and present Australian life in any of its phases. As everyone would appreciate, in normal circumstances, the evening would be coming from one of Australia's finest cultural institutions, the State Library of New South Wales. The library is the home of the Miles Franklin printed book collection. The library is the custodian of Franklin's private letters, literary papers, photo albums, and personal belongings, as well as the small pocket diaries she had kept since 1909. 47 are held at the library, including one copy discovered in 2018. Tonight, as we simultaneously honour Miles Franklin's vision and recognise a group of highly talented authors, I cannot help but think, what would Franklin make of Australia today? She was someone fully engaged in very personal ways with the big questions of the day: workers' rights, class, the terrible effects of war, and the trials and complexities for women from growing up in Australia in the 1890s through myriad challenges in the 20th century. I feel certain she would have been fully engaged with the Australia of today, charmed by the diversity and richness of Australian literature, shocked by what we are doing to our environment, engaged with the issues of gender and identity, and troubled by the disrespect for copyright shown by too many entities. In fact, if I may speculate further, I feel pretty certain that she would have been a vigorous member of the Copyright Agency. She would, of course, have been well versed in copyright. For more than 300 years, such laws have protected the inalienable human right of intellectual property. The first English copyright law in 1710, the Statute of Anne, had a clear intention from its birth notice, being described as an act for the encouragement of learning. Our job at the Copyright Agency is to give contemporary life to copyright, to stand up for writers, publishers, and visual artists. We do this by licensing the work of Australian creators for fair payment, advocating policy settings in Canberra that support creative life, and running legal cases in support of writers and publishers. We also fund a wide range of projects through our Cultural Fund. We have, through the Cultural Fund, been a substantial supporter of the Miles Franklin Award since 2014. It's a privilege for the Copyright Agency to assist with the promotion of the finalists and their work, and to provide each of the year's shortlisted nominees a $5,000 award. I want to recognise all of the Miles Franklin Award authors over the 62 years of the awards, to warmly congratulate the shortlisted authors announced tonight, and to invite you all to wholeheartedly celebrate Australian creativity. Stella's marvellous legacy has honoured since her far-sighted bequest was made over 60 years ago. And I'd personally like to congratulate all of the nominees.
Thank you very much for that, Kim, and I totally agree. Where would we be without our rich stories and their rich diversity? As Miles Franklin herself said, it is the highest form of culture and craftsmanship in art to use local materials. That way you stand a chance of adding to culture rather than merely imitating it. Well, we've reached the moment we've all been waiting for, the announcement of the shortlisted authors for the Miles Franklin Literary Award for 2020. To make the announcement, Adam Suckling, CEO of the Copyright Agency. Take it away, Adam.
Thank you, Cassie. and welcome everyone to this very special version of the Miles Franklin Award 2020 announcement of the shortlist. I'm talking to you from the Miles Franklin room of the State Library of New South Wales. Behind me, you can see all of the entries in the Miles Franklin Award since 2011. Regrettably, they can't include absolutely every entry in the last 60 years, but it's a fantastic shrine and monument to the amazing literature that has been produced under this award. I'd also like to thank Richard Neville, the Mitchell librarian, who very graciously and generously vacated this room, which used to be his office, so the library can display all of these books.
One part of the Miles Franklin Literary Award is very much about supporting authors, giving them opportunities to step aside from the drudgery of life and to give them that space to create. And the other side of it is, I think, that she wanted authors to write Australian stories. So she says that the award is to be given to a novel of the highest literary merit that tells Australian stories in Australian life in any of its phases. So it's quite a broad definition. Literary merit and Australian stories, and those are the two things that she hoped this award would encourage and give Australian authors the opportunity to develop and space in which to write.
Before we honour the shortlist, I would like to recognise all of the work and support by Perpetual in administering and funding this prize. I would also like to thank our media partner, the ABC. They will announce it across their news channels tonight. I would also like to acknowledge the tireless work of our judges: Mitchell librarian Richard Neville, journalist Murray Waldron, academic Dr. Melinda Harvey, bookseller Lindy Jones, and author Bernadette Brennan. Thank you for your time, passion, and commitment to the Miles Franklin Literary Award. Finally, I would like to thank the State Library of New South Wales for allowing us to film in their venue and also for supporting the judging process, which is such a huge task. So without further ado, the moment you have all been waiting for. The shortlisted authors for the 2020 award are Carrie Tiffany for Exploded View.
I had wanted to write a novel about girlhood for some time, and when I thought about my own girlhood, I realised it wasn't so much about following my interests or following my desires, but it was sort of cobbling things together from what was left over, or from the spaces and the gaps, or things that I thought were acceptable and that would be expected of me. Well, I was utterly delighted to learn that Exploded View had been shortlisted for the Miles Franklin. I was very fortunate that my first two books were shortlisted for the award. And this is a darker child, this is a more demanding and a more challenging book. So to me, a novel has a kind of atomicity, it exists completely in and of itself, or it doesn't exist. So copyright means that my work is recognised and protected as a whole, and that's very important. So I think ultimately copyright is really about respect. When I was 15, I went to the Mundaringshire Library and I got a copy of Elizabeth Jolly's first novel, which is called Palomino. And I got it off the shelf because I thought it was going to be a novel about golden horses. Whereas in fact, it's this dense, ardent, tangled, bitter book about a relationship between two women. There's incest in it, abortion, gaslighting. It's a very emotionally violent book. I'd also say Thea Astley has been very important, and more recently the work of Alexis Wright, I think, has been a kind of essential nutrition to me as a reader and as a writer.
Tara June Winch for The Yield.
I wrote the book as a gift to my father and also to my child as well. I wanted to speak about the past, about our painful history, and I wanted to also write a hopeful book that was about reclamation, and it was about pride in our continual cultural integrity and strength as a family. Australian authors that have inspired me, too many to mention, but especially the work of our elders like Alexis Wright, Carpentaria, which is a previous winner of the Miles Franklin, Tony Birch, Melissa Lukashenko. The Miles Franklin Literary Award in particular has created a canon of our stories. It's made readers proud to read Australian stories, to identify with our history and to have hope for what the future's bringing. It's highlighted through Kim Scott and Alexis Wright, previous winners, Indigenous stories and how they are part of the Australian fabric of a nation. Being a finalist is a great honour. It means that I can be a mentor to the next generation of Indigenous writers too, and highlights our overall stories, not just mine.
Next, John Hughes for No One.
I think that primarily the driving force for this book would be historical guilt. That sense of guilt that we feel for acts that precede us, for crimes that seem to have gone on for so long that they no longer feel as if they are crimes. I think that I kind of wrote this book because I was looking for a form in which I might try to understand that guilt. The books that have influenced me most are probably works of history, I think, perhaps even more so than fiction. And certainly when I think about this book, two books, I think, which I read about 20 years ago now, I think. Inga Clendinen's Dancing with Strangers and Henry Reynolds' Why Weren't We Told? Obviously, copyright is extremely important, but with that said, I don't think that really I give a lot of thought to it from day to day, and maybe that's in part because of the fact that we have such a wonderful copyright agency here in Australia that really look after authors' rights and interests. Obviously, as well for me as a writer, winning an award like this would increase the numbers of readers and certainly provide me with a lot more readers than I've been used to. Hopefully, a few of those readers might actually like what they read as well. There are a lot of literary awards in Australia, but I think that the Miles Franklin is the most significant, in part because of its history, but also I think because of the wide light that it's able to cast on the literature of this place.
Next up, Tony Birch for The White Girl.
The idea behind The White Girls, I was very interested in the relationship between Aboriginal women and their children and grandchildren, and the history of the courage of Aboriginal women and older women in particular to keep their families together, to keep their families intact, particularly when those families are under threat from separation or removal. So I wanted to create two characters, Odette Brown, who is the grandmother in the novel, and her granddaughter Sissy, to really produce a story, to produce a novel which showed the courage of an older woman on one hand and the love and tenderness between her and her granddaughter on the other. So while the novel is surrounded in a way by fairly potentially violent events, I wanted to write a book which showed the tenderness and love between the generations of Aboriginal people in the novel. Well, the Australian writer who has probably had the greatest influence on me is Alexis Wright, a great Aboriginal writer who is a winner, by the way, of the Miles Franklin Award for her book Carpentaria. And what I love about Alexis is her ability to tell wonderful stories about the relationship between Aboriginal people and country and land. Australian reading public really follow the Miles Franklin shortlist and the winners of the award very closely, because I think that what Australian readers do is they really judge that award as one that recognises great Australian writing. And for me as a writer, that is enormously satisfying. One of the issues that we know historically is that, Aboriginal storytelling, the creation of Aboriginal work through story, which can be in literature, but can be in painting and other art forms. One of the issues of copyright that I really think is vital is that it protects our story and it protects the storyteller. So in my case as the author, I can be ensured that the work that I produce is given support by copyright, and without that, it would be quite problematic to put your work into the public arena and not feel that there was any protection of that work. So I think copyright gives great protection to storytelling.
Our next shortlisted author is Philip Salom for The Returns.
The particular driving force for my book, The Returns, was to try to catch up with the processes that we stall or that go wrong in our earlier lives. The psychological encounter that my characters have is with themselves, essentially, but also, of course, with each other. And as the two main characters interact with each other, it gives them a kind of extra incentive to do more, so to speak, more work on themselves, but particularly because they desire to find out more about who they were and who they can be. And this sort of sets up a double dynamic, really, because they're both finding each other in the process of finding themselves. I was living out in the country, and someone said, you seem to be a bit bored out here. And they suggested I read this book, and it was Patrick White's The Vivisector. And it influenced me so much that I left the country, went to the city and began painting. And in fact, that little story, somewhat modified, of my discovery of White is actually in my novel The Returns. Copyright is something that all initial creators or primary producers, as the tax department I think registers us as, is automatically of importance. The public tend to forget, and that is that the book itself belongs to the publisher. While the words are copyright to the author, the book has to be protected as well. And for those people who think that either can be transgressed, I think they're very wrong. I think there's very little doubt that the Miles Franklin Award simply has extraordinary prestige. So to be shortlisted or to be longlisted, to be involved in any way whatsoever as a writer is incredibly thrilling, but also it gives reassurance.
And now we have Peggy Frew for Islands.
In writing Islands, I wanted to construct a portrait of a family, and a family which has suffered a significant crisis, that being the disappearance of a family member, a teenage child. I wanted to embrace all of the grey areas of relationships and the differences of perspective and experience that different members of the one family have when it comes to the same event. In my writing, I've been influenced by three authors that spring to mind: Gillian Mears, Helen Garner and Tim Winton. Writing a novel is such a lonely and long experience that to come out the other end and receive this validation is tremendously encouraging. COVID-19 has affected everyone. I actually consider myself to be extremely fortunate in not being too badly affected by it. I think that the arts have been so badly hit across the board in Australia, and I'm really grateful for prizes like the Miles Franklin, which come from a private source, but it would be wonderful to see more support from the government. I think that one of the best things about the prize is that it keeps in our minds the novel as a form when we come to think about writing and what it can reflect about Australia and the stories that exist within this country.
Congratulations to all the authors and publishers for this extraordinary recognition of your work.
Thank you, Adam, and congratulations to all the shortlisted authors. Thanks to everybody watching and those who have made this possible. Please join us in celebrating the nominated authors by using that hashtag, #MFLA2020. Tweet, Insta, whatever you like. Get out there and get the message out. And thanks to the State Library of New South Wales. I trust you've enjoyed proceedings. Next stop, July, and the big one. I'm Cassie McCullagh. See you then.
Copyright Agency. proud supporter of the Miles Franklin Literary Award, standing up for creators for over 40 years.
At Perpetual, we're very proud as trustee to have a role in acting as a steward for the vision that Miles had to ensure that Australian life in all of its phases is appropriately represented and celebrated in literature.
There was a house on a hill in the city and it was full of us. We were a family, a mother, a father, 2 daughters. There was a house on a hill in the city and it was full of us, our family.
But as he
then
walks
it began
back,
to
he
empty.
cannot see their faces in the shadow. Even when he stops in front of them, he cannot. "I'm so sorry, Trevor," says the woman. "It just broke my heart when he left, even if he was a man who
the
cared
warm water
little
over
for us."
Sissy's head,
Who was
her hair darkening as the water ran onto her shoulders. Odette massaged Sissy's scalp, working the soap into a rich lather.
When I came of age, as they used to say, and was no longer a ward of the state, I moved from Cessnock to Sydney and rented a room in a boarding house on the outskirts of Windsor.
There is nothing that this day can give you. It has nothing. The day doesn't know that you were born on it years ago, and it couldn't say happy birthday, even if it did.